substitute, and I think that's probably good because I think a lot of you have already heard me talk too many times. It's true that part of my real conscious goal for a good many years has been to be as transparent as I can to Quakers. Not so much for my benefit, but I think I was hoping it was a role model, because I think that sharing our truth is just essential. Excuse me. That well-known elephant story, the one blind person has hold of an ear, and another the trunk, and another the tail, and another a leg, and the other the side of the elephant. In that story, each one insists on their truth, and it is true. The one with the ear does perceive it as a kind of a palm leaf effect and so forth. But I think what we do is by trying to just share where we are at any given time, we kind of construct an elephant out there in the midst of us that doesn't belong to any one of us. But in fact, it does help us understand who we are, we as a group. And so this thing of telling one's truth just seems to me to be essential to our Quaker way of life. I did listen to as many of the tapes as were available to me from other people who've talked. I was very sorry that every time something interfered with my being here. So I haven't heard any of you in person, but I did listen to what tapes I could, and I noticed that people were doing quite a bit of biographical. So I thought, well, I guess maybe I should do that too. Now we're probably down to about 41 or 40 minutes, and I have my pen out so that I can cross through things.
I just wanted to say I specified the time period out of respect for your need for, I know you always like to have deadlines, but if you want to go over, I don't think it's going to be a problem.
Well, that would be have to be okay with everybody. Oh, okay. Anyone who didn't raise a hand and feels that they need to leave is welcome to leave. Okay. Oh, I need to tell you one other thing. Very stupidly today, I left my hearing aids at home. So I will not be able to hear you very well. Someone else will probably tell me what you said. I hope, and I expect. Well, like every freshman essay, I was born in Philadelphia in a small, not very clean Catholic hospital. And that's important. I was there because my mother's parents insisted that that's where she be. They were devout Catholics of the sort of unenlightened level, and I'm not putting down Catholicism because you'll hear that I have a great respect for Catholic mystics and so on. But this is part of the truth, that there's a range. My father was at that time about a year and a half out of the hospital, having been hospitalized for a year after he returned from France, where he had been blown up in a building. I used to have the clipping and picture of the building, and he was found in the ruins that were left in one corner. He'd had concussion. He had a piece of shrapnel in him when I knew him that traveled, and sometimes it would be in his thigh, and sometimes I could see it poking out down further in his leg. I'm telling you all this because part of what I had to do growing up was to understand this person. And to do that, I had to understand the period in which he grew. He grew up before the war, World War I. It was a fairly stable world, excepting that his mother died and his father had him go live at the Y and paid the Y to keep an eye on him, starting when he was 13 years old. He was a brilliant guy, and he was getting 99% through Penn Charter School, which takes a lot of doing. And then the world fell apart for him even before the war. Then, of course, he enlisted in the war. And in that war, like now, unfortunately, unlike World War II, they didn't know much about rest and recreation. So if a guy got blown up and then could manage to walk in a straight line again, he went back to the front. And they just recycled them back to the front until they were unable to function, and then they got to go home or be in a hospital. So for a year after the war, he'd been in a hospital. And so I was born in 1923, and I was very, very lucky. My mother died of some sort of renal failure 6 weeks after I was born. Nobody ever told me she died because I was born or when I was born. And as they were telling me that it was 6 weeks after, to a small child, that's a long time. It could have been 6 months, it could have been 6 years. I was lucky. It never connected until I was much older that it had anything to do with me. I didn't cause her death. So there's a big guilt thing that a lot of people carry that I never had to carry, and I am so grateful to the people who used that kind of phraseology to tell me what was going on. Okay. At that time, my father was beginning to, I think we'd call him an entrepreneur now. He was beginning to develop a company. And there was money, 1923. I had a wonderful foster mother. Her son had wanted to marry my mother, and he persuaded his mother, who was then in her 60s, to take in Agnes's baby. My father had no brothers or sisters, and his father had nothing to do with him. There were no aunts or uncles around, and my mother's family had nothing to do with him or me. So there were the two of us and my foster mother. And I grew up in a little town in New Jersey in what I now see as a very idyllic life. It was pleasant, it was safe, and heaven was very near. I went to a little Lutheran church, and all I learned there were some Bible verses. I learned the farewell, whither thou goest, I will go. I was quite good at reciting. Always have sort of talked. And I learned that God is love. Later on, when I studied more comparative religions, I found out that Lutherans in some places are not like that. But that's how it was where I was. And I had a little swing. It was a small house in a small yard, and I had a little swing between the back kitchen door and the garage, and I could swing. And I could swing up to heaven. And somewhere up there was my mother, and she was loving me, but I wasn't yearning for her because I was a happy kid. But she was there, and God was there. It was very close. It was very safe. It was very happy. My father would visit occasionally in his, I guess you'd call it a roadster then, a sports car, back top down, and we'd have exciting times. Now and then I visited him in Philadelphia after he had a girlfriend whom he later married. They were part of what I would say was a sort of a fringe of cafe society. She was a flapper. My foster mother thought it was terrible. Flo wore lipstick and smoked, for heaven's sake. But she had to let me go with my father, so I did. They bought me silk panties, which my mother thought was absolutely, my foster mother thought was absolutely ridiculous for a 3 or 4 year old child. And so they got put away till the next time my father came. There was a little disparity going on, but it all felt okay. By the time I was 7, it was 1930. My father's company had folded. There was no more money to pay Mother Summers, and I went to live in Philadelphia with him and his wife, who made it very clear that she had no maternal instincts. She was a business person, and she was a nice person. She was from a Jewish family. She had been born in Russia and had been part of their trek to this country. Her younger sisters were born in this country. I had the fortunate experience of going to Flo's mother's every Friday for the Friday Jewish experience and being there on the high holy days. And it was wonderful. They had very little money, but the older man, he would have been my grandfather's age. He had very little English and made very little money. And I could watch him put on dignity like a cloak when he put on his hat and his shawl for the ceremonies. It's part of what I value so much at having had a very varied kind of background. The Depression, I have come to believe, and I have seen nothing that refutes this, that from any sociologist, I think that it was a different experience in the eastern and manufacturing cities than it was throughout the Midwest. And as I have talked with people in California for the last 50 years, it was different in California. All of those terrible pictures you see, I grew up with. I could ride the bus in Philadelphia or the streetcar, and I could see families standing on the sidewalk, bewildered, with their possessions around them, no place to go, no money for a moving van, no place to move to, and kids standing there hanging on, looking around, wondering what was going to happen. And I would ride by on the bus or on the streetcar and wonder too, what's going to happen? There were, one of the other pictures in my head always were some very distinguished looking gentlemen in very fine suits with that tailoring that you can see, selling apples on the street corner for 5 cents a piece and polishing the apples and asking you to buy them. It's the kind of thing that you don't forget. And even though we were part of it and we got to be very poor and we moved from the 4th floor to the 1st floor and from a front apartment to a back apartment, and I put papers in my shoes to keep the water out and all of that stuff, it gives me a picture of what America was like and what happened to people that I'm glad I had. It was Depression and Prohibition. I got to meet some bootleggers. I got to meet, thank goodness, only one murderer in my life, but I did. He was out between crimes, and then he murdered somebody that I knew and disappeared from my life. I got to go to a school that had other kinds of people down in Pleasantville, and it had been pretty much all people like me. I got to go to school with some black people. I got to go to school with some tough black kids, and with some people who would never have been in public school excepting for the Depression. There was quite a range. This was a little school that was right on the edge of the University of Pennsylvania and had teachers who were accustomed to having the children of professors and so forth. But the range had really shifted during those years. I missed my Sunday school, and of course I was 7 years old when I came to live in Philadelphia. There was a big Catholic church or Baptist church in my block. I could walk from one street corner to the other with permission. Not cross Chestnut Street, but so I started going to the Baptist church. My father said that was okay. Swarthmore Meeting had dropped his name from their roll sometime about the time that he went into the service. And when he came home from the service and tried to find pieces of his life, that was one of the pieces that was missing. So he hadn't gone back to meeting, although he'd grown up in a meeting. So I went to the Baptist church, and I learned a lot more Bible verses and was in some plays. And, those women could make the most amazing costumes out of crepe paper. Does anybody know what crepe paper is?
Yes.
What a versatile substance. So that was great, and it was okay with my father. He was a mystic at heart, and he would always talk to me about what was beyond and behind the Bible verses I brought home and the stories that I brought home, and what was behind the concept of God, and how other people in the world saw divinity differently and had different names for God, and I had to remember that. But the Baptists eventually decided that I was old enough to be baptized, and at that point my father decided maybe I better experience meeting before he gave permission for that big a step. So he and I went to meeting, and the first time we went to meeting, West Philadelphia meeting, we stood on the steps outside, and I was about 9 years old by then, and looked at each other and said, "This is where we belong." And from then on, he and I went to meeting. He became an overseer. He taught the adult education class, this and that. And I plunged into it and had a wonderful time. There was a woman whose Quaker service was to teach First Day School. And she had done it for years, and she did it while I was there. And so I learned more things about the Bible with a slightly different slant. But still knowing the stories and knowing, and we had to memorize, if you please, the names of the books of the Bible. I can still remember some of them. Anyhow, part of my spiritual growth at this time, besides the touches of mysticism that I was getting from my father and the respect for the teachings of Eastern religion, like Buddhism, was I began puzzling about the stories in Genesis, particularly the beginning of things. But fortunately, I was taking some science in school. So it seemed absolutely clear to me that these nomads who were trying to make sense of their world, and that's the way my father had presented it to me, that this was the story of people who were getting better and better acquainted with God, they really were onto something. Because if 1,000 years is a day in God's sight, why not a millennium or 2 or 10? And so I looked at that and I said, well, that's okay. First there was a lot of water, and then there was some land. First there were fish, and then there were mammals, and there were mammals, and then there were people. All makes sense to me. I don't see any argument with evolution. And the fact is that I never really have seen the big problem that, keeps popping up. It just seems to me, okay, somebody way back then already had a glimpse of this idea that things grew out of each other. When I was about 12, they asked me to teach a first day school class. I think they were a little short of teachers. And these were kids almost as old as I was. They were, well, maybe not quite. They were up to about 9. And a couple of very nice ladies came and asked me to teach a course to include temperance. Now, they didn't tell me I had to. These are Quakers. But they came and asked me if I would be willing to include some sessions on temperance. And one of the great things about, congratulate ourselves here at meeting. We have young women in our meeting, children. One of the great things about growing up in meeting is that you can talk, you know you'll be respected, and you have a sense that it's okay to be who you are. And I remember very distinctly saying to them, oh, I'd be glad to do that. Of course, I won't teach abstinence, but I will be very, very glad to teach temperance. And I can still see their faces. They really didn't know quite how to answer that, but with a gulp, it was okay. So, this is all part of spiritual development, really, of seeing things more and more clearly. Well, during these years, we were still very poor, and I was very happy underneath some bad things that went on. And the happiness was the sense that God is love, that this is a world in which underneath everything there's love, and there's some kind of safety. Even if it's not safe to cross the street, there is a basic safety in the things that matter. And I can remember, and this is before I was out of 8th grade, because I remember where I walked to school. I can remember walking to school and wondering if I was insane, because I could tally over on my fingers the things that were wrong and wonder how come I was so happy. And I never solved that one. But I guess now I'd look back and say, well, there was some kind of faith there that just was sustaining, and none of the bad stuff that I encountered could shake that. That's a blessing. I didn't earn it. It's a gift. I'm grateful. Fast forward, I need to say that I talked about my father and said he was complex. Who isn't complex? He was a good man. He was wise. I used to get kind of angry when I was in my teens because the boys and young men later who would come over would spend an hour talking to my father when they were supposed to be taking me out. And some of them were known to make appointments to come and talk to my father when they knew I'd be away to ask him how to handle me. Now, so, you know, but, and this is a big but, and it did affect my life, and that's the reason I'm talking about it. When my mother died and I was an infant and he had money, he was smart enough to go to a psychiatrist who was recently back from training in Vienna with Sigmund and ask him how in the world a man raises a girl all by herself or himself. And apparently the thing that he was told most strongly, and if you've studied Freud, you know this would ring true, was that she has to be comfortable with her sexuality. And you have to see to it that she has a good view of her own body. Well, my father tried to do that, starting with when I started to live with him when I was 12. And I did have a good view of my own body, and I did feel good about myself and glad to be as able as I was, as strong or as quick or whatever. It all felt very good. It developed into incest, and that went on until the time I'm going to tell you about. It went through the stages of courtship virtually, and acceptance by me, to rebellion that wound up in fistfights. And my father taught me how to do a little bit of jiu-jitsu and a little bit of boxing because I was a girl in the city streets. When I really rebelled, I'd try it on him. From year to year, feeling, well, I'm bigger and stronger now. This time I'll really be able to do it. I never could. When I was finally out of high school and hadn't been able to get out of this situation, I went to a Quaker woman late in the summer, and finally told her what had been going on. Told somebody. It's the first time I'd told anybody. She was horrified and found a little scholarship for me to go to Guilford right then. So between August and September, I got to go to Guilford on a scholarship for a year. I was at Guilford in 41. It was a very interesting experience. And I learned what probably everybody learns in college sometime. I learned to argue against the existence of God, and I could do it just as well as anybody else, and we could sit there in a little circle and convince ourselves that, this is a ridiculous idea. And then I realized that I didn't mean that. And many years later, I discovered that I had authority for my position because St. Augustine said the same thing. What I figured out was, you can choose. You can choose which position you're going to take, and I choose faith because that's what feels right to me. And Augustine said the same thing. He said, faith is a matter of choice. And that kind of clarified things a little bit, but I'm glad that I learned all the arguments along the way. While I was there, at that time it was very small, and it was under the care of a program meeting. But they let a few of us from the north have a silent meeting in one of the little buildings. And so we had to go to chapel, and then we could go to our silent meeting. And on a Sunday, just as we were gathering for silent meeting, people began to say, the president says we were attacked. The president says we're at war. And one by one, we'd hear that, and one by one we'd say, oh no, that can't be. No, you heard it wrong. And one by one we became convinced. Yes, Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Yes, we had declared war. Now this was a bunch of people, many of us had been very active, almost all of our teen years, in the peace movement. And when I look back now, I say, you know, we were practically talking about isolationism, which I don't approve of. But we were saying, not this war. It's just them over there. Let them solve their own problems. Keep America out of war. Don't make it any bigger. And then here we were, and our country was at war. This affected me in just as part of the biography because there were some young men on that campus who had been very effective in talking with the merchants in Greensboro and getting some better housing conditions for the Negroes. I'm using the words of the time, for the Negroes. They were only seniors in college, but they had been able to change the way some of those landlords were willing to deal with some of those places. And I could tell you a lot about how we as students interacted, but I talked too long. And those men, young men, just like everybody else, had to go up before the draft board. When they went up to the draft board, and this would be in the spring semester of the year when they were going to graduate, and they said they wanted to file as conscientious objectors. The draft board took them out of school and put them immediately into the camps. They didn't let them finish and get their diplomas, a matter of a few months. Others in other universities and colleges were deferred until they finished their education. I was a freshman, and when I went home that summer and realized what had happened, I felt so guilty that I had the opportunity to go back there. And these people who were, you know, freshman to senior, they were so far above me, and furthermore, they had done such good stuff. And they were having their lives disrupted. So, what stupid decisions we make. I mean, you know, you can love your former self, but they're still we dumb to do dumb things. So I didn't go back to school. I got a job. I don't know why I thought that would help, but it just felt too guilty to go back to school. Anyhow, my father had managed to be working on behalf of the housing association with slum tenants, and so he'd been vocal in working against the slum landlords. In Philadelphia, the conditions were terrible, terrible. There were laws and rules and supposedly investigations and inspections, but they were terrible. So when I did go home, he'd been beaten up by a gang and had a broken jaw and a couple of broken ribs and a broken arm. And it was, it was an attack by the landlord's people. So part of my not going back to school was that I thought I better take care of him or be there. And he had moved into one of these slum apartments. And if you hadn't ever seen it, you couldn't believe it. It was a tiny little room with a half partition, full-size wall that only went half the width of the room. On the other side was the kitchen sink, the little stove, little bitty stove, and the toilet. And that had passed inspection and was what was being rented, sometimes to families. Well, I'm glad I had the experience. We didn't stay there long. I'm glad for all these experiences. Sometimes I feel as if they're wasted on me because I haven't found a chance or a way to use them as well as I might have. But part of growing up, and this is something that I've worked for since I've been out in California, there was a man named Bruce Bliss Forbush from Baltimore Yearly Meeting who ran a camp on the Patuxent River every summer and leadership training for Quakers. And old and young people came. It wasn't just a kids' camp for play, and we had curricula. We learned more about the Bible, we learned teaching methods, and we learned Quakerism. And we had homework. Now, you could do your homework in a rowboat on the Patuxent under the shade of trees. But you learned. And Race Street Meetings sent me back there for 3 years in a row so that I got the full curriculum. It was great training, and what a wonderful thing for them to do. This is my vision of what Friends Meetings, can and should be alert to do for their people. Somebody wise in that meeting saw that there was a kid living in pretty straitened circumstances, not in a slum. We were in a decent apartment and all that. But they got me out into this wonderful place and got the training, and I owed them, and I paid back all over the years because I've taught First Day School ever since. Up until very recent years, I taught, I took it on here for 25 years. I was in Mojave, and I became, not by trying to, I became the superintendent of their Sunday school, other places. In Mojave, one of the things that I did was to go with the new pastor. We drove over the crest, mostly, to Los Angeles every week for about 2 months. And his wife came along. She had had experiences of young women thinking that pastors were somehow wonderful, and so she came along. But it was more training. Los Angeles offered interdenominational training for people who were going to work with children. And when I talk to people today about this youth program coordinator for the yearly meeting, I do say, what training are we asking for? Because I know it's there. And it helps. It helps a lot. And I could tell you a story about something out here, but again, I'm not going to do that. Just personally, somebody came to the superintendent of schools came to me in Mojave and asked me if I'd please be a substitute teacher. I think you've heard us. I don't think it's anything else. I thought I saw his son here earlier. Yeah, the son is sitting next to him. Okay. She's a nurse.
think so, yeah. Thank you. Just fill it out. That's all right. There you go. Yeah, here.
Diane's a nurse. Diane's a nurse.
Yeah, that is.
Stay here.
Yeah, just put both your hands there. All right, ready? Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. Good nap. Yeah, good nap. Yeah, go backwards into that chair right there. There we go.
What about the armchairs?
There you go.
What about the sofa?
Yeah, put it down, put the chair on there. That's right. That's right.
You might be able to lift it over to the sofa.
Yeah, we'll get some armchairs. There we go. Yeah.
His pulse was fine. His heart was nothing. So his breathing was okay.
This has happened before in meeting, and I try to sometimes sit with him so I can hang on to him, but Jane, I don't think most of us would accuse you of being unusually soporific, but this time.
Ed and I were in Friend Central School for 1 year at the same time.
Wow.
He was 1 year behind me. And so it was fun to find Ed here in this meeting when I came to this meeting. I guess part of what I'm trying to say is that I've been a Quaker just about all of my life, and I've been away from meeting sometimes for years while I was doing this superintending of First Day Schools in a community church and all that. But I was a Quaker. And it's the Quaker background, the insistence on learning, on knowing, that made it easy to understand what the Congregationalists are talking about, what the Episcopalians are talking about, what the, any of the churches that I got to be around. I really appreciate that Friends care about the truth and they care about learning. And I really do want our kids to grow up to know the things that are kind of basic to our society, because whether we like it or not, our society is pretty Christian in many, many ways. I once had a student when I was at San Diego State. I was teaching some strange course about decision making or something, and she told me she was taking a course in religion. And I asked, why? What led to this? She was an art major. She'd grown up with no religion. She had no idea what the paintings were that she was supposed to be studying. She didn't know what the stories were. And she thought she'd better find out, since so many of them were based on Bible stories, what all this music, what all these paintings were about. That's what I don't want our kids to have to do. That's a little sidetrack. We were in La Jolla, in Encinitas, I want to say, for almost 10 years before I found La Jolla Meeting. At that time, we didn't advertise in the phone book. And who in the world coming to this community would expect to find the only Quaker meeting not listed as San Diego meeting, not listed as Quakers, not listed as Society of Friends, listed under La Jolla? But once I found it, of course, I've been here ever since. We do now advertise, and I'm very much in favor of it. And we can have little pieces in more of the newspapers, I think. When I was still young, I developed a principle about, it has to do with committees. I have a great awe for committees and how the Spirit moves in committees. And I have particular awe for nominating committee and some for ministry and oversight. And I've made it a habit, if nominating committee asks me to do something, no matter how outlandish, like if they ask me to be on finance, I never say no immediately, because nominating committees somehow, and they're just plain people whom I know all the time and we have coffee together, but when they're doing their nominating committee work, the Spirit guides them, and they touch people and ask them to do things that nobody ever thought they could do. And if it's right and the person says yes, they do it, and they do it very, very well. And I have seen this over and over again, not just in my life, but in others. And I've had people come to me and say, nominating asked me to do this. What do you think? And I say, well, nominating committee sees something in there. How do you feel? Well, they decide they're going to be brave enough to take it on. And they have done very, very good jobs. The Spirit does come. Christ stopped at Iboli, and the Spirit comes to committee meetings when we wait and we listen. It was in that spirit that I've been clerk of this meeting a couple of times, and I was clerk of the yearly meeting. And that was a big decision to say yes to. I had kids at home. Anyhow, it was a big decision, but I think it was the right thing. I hope this isn't too much biography. I hope this is what you wanted. I hope you understand that I'm trying to express the spiritual underpinning of all of this that is so much part of my life. I used to wonder what in the world led the Gnostics. Remember when we discovered the Gnostic Gospels? That structure that some of them had of layers of gods and godlings and this and that. What in the world? But as I have come to realize that the what some people call the divine soul, the world soul, the divinity behind divinity. Sometimes you can almost see it. You can almost grasp it. It's like, now Lauren Isley, I think, described it well, paleologist. He talked about those vast ages back. And the more he talked about it in his poetry and his writing, the more you could see the awe that was developing. And of course, I think all of the sciences eventually lead to mystery. You go deep enough to any science, apparently, and it's the same mystery. We don't know what it is yet, but it's there. The line, and I can't remember who, it might have been Keats, somebody, Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. This vastness that is divine or holy or beyond comprehension is something that, for myself, I can only glimpse now and then. I can't live at that level all the time, but I know it's there and I can glimpse it now and then. Somebody, I can find what I want here. Well, if I find it later, it's just another little quote. somebody actually, oh, it was Vaughn, said, I saw eternity the other night in a clear circle of light. And then, being a poet, he went on and said other stuff. And it was pedestrian. But I know what he meant. I saw eternity the other night. We get glimpses. For myself, I give myself permission to believe that divinity is so vast that if little me is hurting and I need to cry out to my Father God, it's okay, because that's real too. And sometimes I'm a Quaker, I have to ask questions. So I say to myself, am I being too easy on myself? But sometimes it seems as if, hey, I'm human. And God knows I'm human. And if God can love me with all my failings, and I'm absolutely sure that she does, or he does, then I can give myself permission to call on that aspect of God that I need at the time, knowing that it's all part of the wholeness. The thing that I see so much is the great dance. It just seems to me as if that's just what it is. I think about the atoms, the molecules, the stars, and they're all part of it. And the star dust that is still in motion, it's all part of it. In 1997, I wrote a little poem, and I'm going to read it, I guess. To Gaia, the Eternal Mother. I will sing to you a new song, Gaia, while my friend creates his dance for you. Shall I tell you how lovely you are? Your clear skies and soft-scented air, your clean water and fragrant forests, all of your speckled, striped, and tawny beasts, and my kind, humans, in their exuberant creativeness, the rich and varied treasures hidden deep within your healthy loam. Yes, I sing to them and to you. I rejoice in you. I give thanks to you. This brief life I have so enjoyed as I sang and danced within your care has been filled with celebration and sustained by many friends. Now, in their company, I can return the atoms I have borrowed from your store with gratitude, in peace, and in the comfortable knowledge that you, Gaia, will use them in ways I cannot even visualize. Your precious building blocks you loaned to me. Now I will rest a while. Dear Mother, thanks. And I still feel that way. The I that is me may rest, that the building blocks go on, the great dance goes on. Gosh, it's 11:15, friends. You know me. Yes, I have a couple more things here, but I think maybe I should let you go. Okay?
Jane, would it be all right if I just said anybody who needs to leave can leave now, and the rest of us
Okay.
would be delighted to stay?
It's not a whole lot more. Because this is stuff that I hope I haven't used the time foolishly. I hope it's been right.
No, I think if you just unedit yourself, we could like Jane Pierce Unplugged.
Well, I want to talk about forgiveness. See, I had a lot to forgive when I was a kid growing up. And yet I had to continue to live with the person who was hurting me most. And there was a lot to admire in that person. And I had no place else to turn. So I had to make a study. And I probably could have gotten better grades if I had been studying my schoolwork as hard as I was studying to understand what was going on in my life and my father. I came to believe, and I know I've said in this meeting years ago, that forgiveness is the path to forgiveness for me was through understanding. If I was willing to study and pay attention enough to truly understand a situation or a person, I could find the forgiveness. But it took a lot of work to truly dig down to that kind of understanding. I'm still very, very skeptical of the sort of instant forgiveness that sometimes gets preached. I would never say, look at your neighbor and whatever you have against her, forgive her right now. I just wouldn't be able to do that. But through understanding, I think we can come to forgiveness of even the most awful things. My father lived with me for the last 15 years of his life in love and peace. And we had fun together, as we had had long before. And he was good with my children. And my husband liked having him. I think forgiveness is so important. And it seemed to me that this is part of divinity, that there is forgiveness from the divine. That, and I'll put in those anthropomorphical terms because they communicate better. The God who made us knows us and forgives us before we ask. The forgiveness is waiting for us. We just have to accept it. And this came to me as such an insight at one time that I wanted to stand on a street corner and look at these people, because I came to realize, and I was in psychology and so on, that so many people are carrying such a weight of guilt, so much guilt. And they don't need to. And then gradually, I realized I want to stand on a street corner and say, you know, you really are, you're already forgiven. Stop blaming yourself. Get on with life. Be who you are. Forgive yourself. You're already forgiven by the important people. And then I realized this is Quaker. This is experiential. There would be no difference to the ears of the passerby between what I was saying and what some other people of whom I don't so much approve were saying. It wouldn't sound any different, probably, because we can't really give away our experience. We can only share it, like I'm doing now and others have done. That's all we can do. Maybe the task that we have is to try to find ways to help people find their own way to that point. We can't give it to them, but maybe we can do more to help them find it. And that doesn't mean standing on a street corner. So I haven't stood on too many street corners. But then, even later, I was allowed to live longer, and I've come to have the experience in meeting for worship, and then sometimes not in meeting for worship, of really feeling, being a part of the compassion that is so much a part of the divinity behind everything. There's some kind of a benevolent force that keeps thrusting us toward wholeness toward being ourselves, toward being complete. It's the same force that makes a seed take root through a little crack in the pavement and grow and be a whole tall weed in a place that it had no business thriving. It's the same thing that makes there's things are so poignant sometimes when you see a little child who's blind or crippled, and they're happy, and they're playing, and they're being all they can be. It's that kind of thing that I think is impelling all of us toward wholeness. That's what we're seeking. And we come closer to it. When we get it a little bit close to it, we can share that sense of compassion for the whole suffering world. And it is. And that compassion is free, it's there, and if we can just hold on to it, it can color our dealings with people in our daily lives. So I grew up a little and I learned that there's a forgiveness beyond understanding. Both are, I think, valid, but beyond. I think the only other thing, there is one thing. This is just two little things. Quaker personality. It seemed to me that there are a couple of things that are personality traits that Quakers need. And one of them is an enormous tolerance for ambiguity. And the other is a great comfort with paradox. And these two things are just inherent. We are, I think, remember Burton talked about the mythos and the logos. We often talk about the intellect and the intuition. We sort of demand of ourselves that we integrate these and that we live with the fact that action is very important in the world, and it's very important to meditate. It's not one or the other. We put things together. And most of the Quakers that I know are more comfortable with our queries than creeds. And so we ask each other these questions all the time. I was on the committee that worked for years and years on writing Faith and Practice. We ask ourselves these questions all the time. Just try getting us to agree on an answer. And then try to put it down. And then send it out to 400 people, Quakers, and say, is this what you mean? But we're comfortable with the queries. And I think this is part of, being comfortable with ambiguity. And the other thing, just as a matter of who I am, I don't see any big problem with miracles. Jesus is reported to have said, anything I can do, you can do too. Well, at this point, I can't. But if I knew enough, I probably could. Go back to the great dance. Go back to what we now know about, atoms and molecules and so forth. If I knew enough, I feel certain that I could rearrange the molecules on my feet so that I could walk on water. I just don't know enough yet. So I don't really have a whole lot of trouble with miracles. And one of the miracles that, the world is so open to possibility. If you postulate infinity, and then you go into the theory of, I'm trying to say chance, probability, random. Why wouldn't it be that the actual physical components that make this body sometime somewhere would just by chance happen to come together and make a body that was exactly the same. Why not? But you have to be able to have a little view of infinity and eternity to come up with that. But still, miracles are not a big problem as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of very wonderful things have happened. I thought that you would want to know, because people very often do want to know about older people, how one older person feels about death and dying. So, back in the 70s, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross opened this whole topic, it's still in class, and I remember that so many of my classmates who were younger than I was in my 50s by then, I think, were really enchanted with the idea of the young man saying to his father, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the coming of the dark." And I remember writing at that time and saying, this is a young person talking. Somebody ask the older person how they feel. Because we don't all rage. And we don't want to rage, and we don't really want somebody to encourage us to rage. There's an American poet who isn't outstanding, but he wrote Thanatopsis when he was quite young.
He wrote what?
It's very long. That's quite an image. The end of it has been so important to me. He talks about the caravan that is marching and how Earth is a huge sepulcher. It's not morbid. And he said, "So live that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan, thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams." That sounded good to me when I first read it when I was about 12, and it still sounds good to me. Henry Vaughan again said, "They're all gone into the world of light." And I feel that way about some of the friends in our meeting. I miss them. I love them. They're gone into a world of light. And he says, like the person, he that hath found some fledged bird's nest may know at first sight that if the bird be flown. But what farewell or grove he sings in now, that is to him unknown. And it seems to me that's what we do. We let people go into a world of light with love, and we don't know. And for me, it's okay that I don't know, because, and this sounds really, vain. I'm absolutely sure that it will be okay with me. It has my permission to be whatever it is. But there may be something, there may not be anything. If there's nothing, I won't know it. If there is something, it's probably more lessons to learn. I had some experiences with my mother that led me to think that there may be something later, and that there are more lessons, and that there's some things to be done. And for me, it felt as if she was given permission to come back to me now and then when I really needed her. But the last time that I felt her presence, she told me I was a grown woman now and I had a child of my own, and she really had to go on and do her work. And I don't expect to see her again until I get to that gate and walk through that gate. So I don't know, but it feels okay. And I think that's the main thing that I can tell you about how one old person feels about it. I hope it's okay. I've finished.
Very much.
Okay.
Did you think you were going to die in 1997 when you wrote that Gaia poem?
When what?
When you wrote that Gaia poem?
No, that was on a retreat, just looking at nature. No, I wasn't going to
Is
die.
that the feelings that you just described in prose are kind of mirrored in that poem
Mhm.
in poetry?
It's the same
Yeah.
thing. It's the same thing. Now, I've had a couple of those near-death experiences. And, you know, coming from this society, as I said, all my icons are pretty much Christian. So, sure, across the gate, guess who was there? People and somebody in a long white robe. One time, my baby was 6 weeks old, and I knew I could go. And I said, no, I really can't do this to her. I can't do to her what happened to me. Furthermore, my father's the only person here with me, and I can't do that to him a second time in his life. And so I didn't go. The next time was many years later, and it was a similar scene. And I said, here I come. And I got a real clear message, nope, you've got work to do. You're not welcome now. Go back. There'll be a time. So I went back and picked up my shovel. And you can explain all this stuff away, and people have, and, you know, you take it for whatever it's worth. Now, unless somebody wants something, I'm really finished.
I have a question. One more. What do you feel like? What do you feel like God's saying to you recently?
I'm glad and sorry that you asked that. I feel that I should be doing something to help Quakers find a way to help with the aftermath of war now. Some Quakers did a pretty good job after World War I. Not quite so much after World War II, although they did work for the Japanese who had been interned here in California effectively. Now, I really think that the escalation in violence in our society can be traced in part to the number of people we have among us who have experienced such horrendous violence. Both have done atrocious things and have had atrocious things done to them. And we don't, until very, very recently, we have spent disgracefully little money on detraining our service people. All kinds of money training them to be automatons. Very little money trying to undo that. And I think there's a place for Friends to help with that situation, and that's what I feel a call to do. And it's not clear to me yet what the first step is. Burton may be doing some of it.
Yes.
Are there any other questions? Want to think about? Thank you so much, Jane.
Thanks, Jane.
Well, thanks.
If a couple of trained people would help shut the window